the way you get to a stick with it moment is that you have a bad reaction to something. Like it is in that moment where you look around and you're like, oh my gosh, I am so out of my comfort zone. I don't want to be here. I got to bail out. That exists for a reason. It exists to keep us safe from the lions and the tigers, right? But in most of our lives, we are not, at risk when that is happening.
Welcome back, everybody. We're joined today by Julie Rose. Julie is a journalist and the host of the Top of Mind podcast. Julie, welcome. We're so happy to have you.
It is my pleasure. Good to see you both, Jason and Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Anthony, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm really excited about the topic, so ready to dive in.
Me too. All right. So yeah, Julie, we'd love to learn just a little bit about who you are, your background, and then we'll dive into the moments that brought you to where you are today.
Okay. Well, I think the headline, since I'm a journalist, is that I'm a journalist who would rather avoid the news if at all possible, but doesn't feel like that's feasible as a journalist, but also just as a human, a person in the United States of America who wants to be engaged in making the world a better place and being a better person. So to catch you up to that point, I've been a radio journalist for about 20 years. Started out in public radio reporting, so worked at a public radio station in Salt Lake City, and then a station in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, for 6 years. And then I ended up leaving that job, which I loved. I mean, during that time, I was reporting frequently for appearing on Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and there was just so much really interesting news that was going on and important issues there in the South. So it was really my dream job in many ways. But my parents needed some help. They were aging. They were still back in my hometown of Provo, Utah. And so I made the decision to go back and be able to help them. So I left that job, came back to Utah, not really knowing where my career was going to go because there wasn't a public radio station in Provo, Utah. But right around that same time, my current network was getting going, BYU Radio, which is affiliated with the university here in town, Brigham Young University. They had a satellite radio station, Sirius XM, channel 143, and they had a need for content. So I started hosting a daily live radio show. So you guys can imagine what it's like to, do an interview, right, where you're going to use most of it. And I don't know, how many do you do? Like a couple a week, maybe, interviews like this? Okay. So I was doing 6 interviews a day, every single day, live on the radio. These were 15 to 20-minute conversations about every topic under the sun that you can imagine. I mean, we were talking about current events. It was a drive time show. It was an interview-based show. So I wasn't pontificating because I don't really have very interesting opinions anyway, but we were doing this daily live radio, 6 interviews about the latest in scientific discoveries, the big issues going on in education and in social issues and cultural issues. Sometimes we'd do fun cultural stuff. A lot of it, though, was talking about the big issues of the day. Presidential election cycles and things happening in Congress and government shutdowns and wars and just like all the things, right? Climate change. We were talking about all of that every single day. For 7 years, Monday through Friday, for 2 hours, I estimated once, well over 10,000 interviews during that time period. And it was really fun, really exciting to do all that prep and try to make a really compelling conversation live on the radio when you only have 15 minutes and people are going to get bored and change the channel if you don't really get to the good stuff. So it was really fun, kind of high wire dance, and I really enjoyed all that we got to learn. But I got to towards the end of that, and I just didn't want to open a newspaper let's be honest, who actually opens it? Well, I didn't want to open a browser, right? I didn't want to get the news on the browser. I used to be one of these people that would, the news was all I consumed. I would wake up in the morning, my alarm clock was the news. Like it would be the news, the local news station waking me up every morning. I love music, but everything I had in my life was news. I would go into the shower. I remember I lived in an apartment, and I didn't have a shower radio, but I didn't want to miss anything, and so I'd crank it way up on my boombox, to get into the shower. My neighbors, I would get these mean notes on my door, like, your radio is too loud at 7 a.m. I'm like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. So anyway, I was pretty obsessed with the news, constantly following it. And I got to this place 7 years into this daily live radio show where I'd been living and breathing the news, and I just didn't want to do it anymore. But I'm a journalist. What else was I going to do? I mean, I'm not going to go be a radio DJ, and I wasn't going to, I'd have to change careers. This is like a moment of real career crisis for me. But also it was very embarrassing because I had made my name as a journalist. And what kind of journalist doesn't want to follow what's going on in the world, So I was doing a lot of pretending and kind of just feeling like my soul was being sucked out, it just was not a good place to be. And I'm prone to depression. I'm also a very anxious person. And it was just a bad mix. So this was, kind of like heading into the pandemic. So things only got worse in the pandemic. And I was trying to figure out, how do I do this? Do I change my career? How can I engineer a life that feels better to me? And so I went through a period where I was just completely ignoring the news except for what I had to do for work. And I was just listening to music, and that felt great. But after, 6 months of that, I was feeling kind of like I didn't know what was going on in the world in a way that felt like I could get involved, What I'm saying is I came to feel like avoiding the news wasn't going to work for me. And so then I had to say, well, okay, what would it take to consume the news in a way that wouldn't be negative for me, that would feel productive, that wasn't going to be feeding my anxiety and depression, but was also going to leave me feeling empowered, and help me to feel like I had a sense of how to work for the better community that I want to live in, that I could understand some of these issues. So I went through a lot of trial and error over the last 4 or 5 years trying to figure out how to do that effectively. And I've learned some stuff that I would love to share with you. But as it also happened in the process, professionally, I had a new opportunity come along. My same network, we had new management come in. This was just a couple of years ago, right at the end of 2021. And we had the opportunity to stop doing daily live radio, which was a huge relief because I was pretty burned out by that, and turn our show into a podcast, but kind of like a blank slate. They basically said, all right, if you were going to do a podcast instead, using all of your skills, what would you do that for? What would it be like? And right around the same time, this was an important turning point for me. I read an op-ed, an opinion article in the Washington Post, written by a journalist named Amanda Ripley, who had covered wars and conflicts. And the headline was, and now I'm going to get it wrong, I should have looked it up, but it's like, I'm a journalist and I avoid the news, or I can't stand to consume the news. And, of course, all the lights were going off. I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one. Wait a second. And it was in that article that I learned that 40%, it turns out there's been research on this. The Reuters Institute of Journalism, International Institute, does this research, and almost 40% of Americans actively avoid the news, either all the time, or they actively avoid certain parts of it, or they go on sort of news diets. And I'm like, well, that's a relief that I'm not the only one. And also, maybe I can do something about that. And so we started trying to figure out, how could we make a podcast that would be for those people like me, people like a lot of Americans out there who don't like the way the news makes them feel, that it feels polarizing, it feels biased, it feels depressing, it feels overwhelming. Those are all reasons that people cite for why they want to avoid the news. But also, many of us want to be engaged in our communities and be informed on important issues so that I can be a more informed voter, so that I so that I can weigh in and be part of a solution when big issues come up in my community. And so that I can have conversations with people that don't end in me feeling either uninformed or getting really angry and blowing up. So that's what Top of Mind is. We're a podcast for people who want to engage with the news in a way that will leave them feeling optimistic and empowered. And we tackle one tough topic each week, and we try to do that. I'm happy to talk about how, and I'm also happy if you'd like to talk about sort of what strategies I've found. I'm curious to know if either of you have felt the inclination, or maybe you still are, and you can totally admit this, to avoid the news.
Yes, I don't avoid it 100%, but there are definitely times where I feel completely overwhelmed, and everything that you see is just negative and makes you think that the world is a horrible place and it's on fire and we're all just going to die in the next week. And so I actually have a question, I think, that's more related to the news industry.
Yeah, sure. I have lots of thoughts. Let's talk.
Is that a conscious decision by the companies, these media companies, to push all this sort of sensationalist negative news on people because that's sort of what gets conversation happening, is what gets ratings, versus trying to actually find some kind of neutral middle ground story that's not going to make everybody think that the world's on fire?
Yeah. What do you think? Do you think they're purposely doing it to us?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Because it makes money, right? Everything's about the money.
I heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads. And that was enough for me to turn the news off.
Totally fair. Yeah. Okay. So I'm a journalist who also has a hefty amount of skepticism and sort of there are things that I would very much like to see journalism do better in modern America. But also I understand a lot of the impulses. So on the question of are journalists intentionally trying to tell us the very worst news possible out there? Journalists are trying to tell stories that matter, trying to report on things that matter, and they're trying to write and produce stories that you will read and watch and click on. And if you think about the last movie you went to or the last book you read, I mean, was it a show where nothing really of huge import happened to anybody and everyone sort of was happy at the end, right? No, right? Conflict is a core piece of interaction. It's part of we want to see, and sometimes I think conflict in and of itself is not bad. Conflict is how we get progress. It's the fact of disagreeing and sort of wrestling with the need, wrestling up against boundaries and figuring out how to overcome obstacles. Every good story includes, I would use the word tension. There's something that somebody is trying to overcome, or there's a disagreement, or there's a conflict, or there's a clashing of worldviews because one person, whatever it is, think of all the superhero shows, right? You've got good and evil. Well, that's part of it. Journalists are storytellers. We want to report the news, but we also want to tell a story. And news consumption is about consuming stories. And so that combines to create a situation where often journalists have an antenna really tuned toward conflict and tension, because that feels like, oh, that's a story I could tell. I'd love to tell the story of that underdog or this conflict in this community or this, these dramatic, disastrous things that are happening in the world. And as a result, we have a bias for that. And guess what? So do we as news consumers have a bias for that. Because like I said, nobody wants to go see a movie where nothing happens and there's nobody in conflict and tension and then the end, right? So we as humans are tuned to focus on that kind of thing. So that's the one thing. The second thing I'll say is that, yes, as it has become more and more financially difficult to make money in journalism because mostly of the internet and because of the proliferation of both, basically because of Google ads and Facebook ads and sort of all the ad money has kind of been drained away from mainstream media and has gone towards clicks and social media. coupled with the fact that we have so many choices out there in the world now that news consumers can go so many different places to get information, it has created an environment where if it bleeds, it's likely to get more clicks. If it's sensational, it's likely to get more clicks. If the headline has to be snappy, or else you're not going to click. And unfortunately, a lot of journalism has been forced into this ecosystem where we can't just tell a complicated, nuanced story. It has to be a story that's going to provoke an emotion of some sort in order to get you to click so that we can get the credit for that, so that it can be monetized in some way, so that we can continue to pay the salaries of the journalists, right? So that's part of what's going on here. And I think one thing that I've come to realize is that there are a lot of outlets out there. There's a whole movement called solutions journalism. There's a thing called the Solutions Journalism Network that really encourages journalists and newsrooms to make sure that when they are reporting on these big, important stories and these world, the major influential conflicts, that we also don't lose sight of the solutions that are out there, that we make sure that we include in the scope of our storytelling people who are doing things or solutions that could be on the, or common ground, that we're not falling too quickly into this good versus evil. There's good guys and bad guys in every single story, which is another human sort of like urge that we have, right? It's why we love fairy tales. It's why we love superhero stories, because, you got good guys and bad guys. Well, but guess what? We also really love what's the name of the Breaking Bad guy, Walter or whatever his name is, right?
Walter White?
Yeah. We also like really complicated anti-heroes, who are like heroic in some ways, but also like really amoral in some ways, or immoral. And we like those complicated. I mean, Deadpool's another example, right? Like, we like these kind of bad good guys. And so we have the capacity and we're drawn to complication if it's given space as part of the story. And this is one of the things that Amanda Ripley, who I mentioned, who wrote that op-ed that I mentioned earlier, and something that's kind of drawn from a lot of the research that comes out of the difficult conversations and conflict resolution lab at Columbia, is the notion that when you complicate the story, if you can allow the story to have some complexity, if you can allow for the fact that that the lines aren't clearly drawn, good guys, bad guys, if you can allow for the fact that humans can have contradictory motives and opinions on things, and if we can leave those components in our story, that it will help listeners can handle it. First of all, readers can handle it. It's not going to turn us off, but that also it allows us to kind of get away from this binary way of seeing the world that has driven us into our polarized corners. If you listen to, and this is another thing that I think really turns a lot of people off about, news consumption today, is it feels like no matter where you're reading or what channel you're tuned to, there's only one view that is the right one. And even if you're an unbiased, quote unquote, or objective, which is another thing that doesn't really exist in journalism, at least I don't think so, because everybody has a perspective that they bring to bear on the reporting and the choices that they're making, but that's another story. That you're still there. There's just this real tendency to kind of be like, in the kinds of language that we use to describe, the adjectives, the sorts of quotes that we choose from different guests, the kinds of facial expressions that we hone in on, when we're on video. There's a real inclination to sort of set up, even very subtly, the good guys and the bad guys. I'm saying guys, kind of generally, humanity, like the good people and the bad people. And we crave that as consumers because it's, like I said, it sort of like pushes those real simplicity, dopamine buttons. And we like to feel like we're on the side of the good guys. But when so much of the media feels like, there's people on one side and people on the other side, then I'm immediately feeling attacked or disrespected if the perspective is coming from the side that's not me. And if I'm consuming news only from places that agree with my worldview, then all I'm really getting all the time is like, yeah, we're right. We're the good guys. And so it kind of builds up in our minds this notion that there are only two positions, and one is good and one is evil. And then we end up walking around in our lives thinking that the person who has the lawn sign for the candidate that we don't like, well, they're a bad person, you know? We don't just differ in our political views. Like, they are literally, all the things, right? Yeah, you've kind of touched a lot of my hot buttons there, Jason. But I do think that it's both that the challenge is, I think that we cannot. It's not enough for us to say, yeah, the news is biased, or the news is inflamed, or the news that the problem is journalists are doing it wrong. Yes, there are things that journalists can be doing better. We can be better at acknowledging our own biases, at sort of like not stop pretending that there's such a thing as objectivity, complete and total objectivity, that we can be more transparent in the choices that we're making about the way that we're telling these stories, and that we can not be afraid to report complicated stories and allow somebody to have contradictory views so that we can show the full humanity of these issues. It's very hard to do when the world wants 30-second TikToks and we want our news in headlines. So there's a lot that feels like, if journalists only had the space and the financing, they could definitely do reporting differently, and a lot of them would. But as consumers, we also have a lot of control over what we do as we're consuming the news, in order to still find ways to overcome a lot of those things that we feel like are being imposed upon us by the media. Guess what? We're the consumers. We get to choose how we consume. And there's a lot of stuff that's just not counterintuitive, like reading an entire article. When is the last time you actually read every single word in a story?
Couldn't tell you.
Yeah, it's a fair question.
Yeah, couldn't tell you.
We just don't do it. Look, I have to, this is a daily practice that I have to do. Well, okay, I don't do it every day because I'm a human, but one of the things I realized, this is maybe my biggest piece of advice, is I realized that a lot of the overwhelming nature of the news for me, a lot of what felt like I was constantly just being jerked around by my emotions, and I was either being condescended to, or I was being preached, or I was sort of feeling like righteous indignation all the time, or, and that the world is burning up and everything. No, we may as well, give up. I realized that a lot of that had to do with this habit of consuming the news, where I would open up a news page, any major news website, and I would start scrolling. I'm reading headlines. I'm reading the headline, and then there's like maybe one little subline sometimes. I'm scrolling the headlines. And not too long ago, I realized that news pages themselves, even when so that's reading, I'm putting in quotes, scare quotes, right? I'm reading the news. What I'm really doing is just reading headlines. And I'm also kind of just like doom scrolling. So you know how if you're on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, Twitter, you can just like scroll for ages. There will always be something more. Well, news sites are doing that. A lot of them are doing that now too. So there's like no end to the page. One of the sites I go to a lot is like the New York Times or the Washington Post. You can keep on scrolling. Like you have to scroll for a really long time to hit the end of something, right? They're just going to keep on throwing more material at you, but it's all headlines. It's only headlines and photo captions, which, as we just established, are specifically designed to provoke some sort of emotion to get you to click, right? So already I'm only just consuming the most inflammatory, if you want to use that word, the frosting, on the cake. And so at some point I realized that what I needed to do instead, what I try to do instead is, rather than just scroll endlessly, I will sort of time limit myself. I'm going to scroll I'm going to look at the front page and kind of just get a sense for all the stories that are going on. And I'm going to stop scrolling, once I feel like I've sort of seen the opinions and the local news and the national news and like the food and culture. Okay, I'm going to be like, all right, I kind of have a sense of what's happening in the world. I'm going to pick one story. I'm going to read every single word of that story. And I'm going to pick one that I'm interested in. I'll tell you in a minute what my favorite hack is, but I'll pick I'll pick one story. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, okay, well, this week there's like when the war broke out between Israel and Gaza most recently, I'm like, I really don't understand a lot of this. So all of my choices for at least a week and a half were stories about that conflict. I was kind of like, I'm going to school here. I'm really going to educate myself. Okay, and then the practice is, and it's like going to the gym. I mean, I'm doing this partly because I'm trying to flex this muscle and make it stronger. My attention and my ability to read critically and to notice how the news is affecting me, and rather than just be jerked around by it. So I'll pick a story, and then I'm like, all right, well, I'm in for this whole story, no matter how bored I get halfway through it, no matter how much I feel like I want to click away, and then I'll notice at what point do I start thinking, gosh, I'd really rather read something else. At what point do I start thinking, I really do not agree with this? Like, oh, that person, I don't like. Each of those is a moment where I would naturally want to click away and go read something else. But I force myself to stay there and keep reading because that is the skill that I want to practice in my daily life. I want to be better at being able to recognize my inclinations and emotions when I am sitting in the presence of a perspective that I disagree with, rather than going to my gut reaction, which is, I don't agree with that, and getting all angry and wanting to debate or wanting to put my view forward, or bailing out because I'm like, oh, this is uncomfortable and I'm a conflict avoider and I don't want to have to be here and blah, 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 and now all I have is just all these judgments in my mind about this other person that like, well, now that I know they're that, I know that they're terrible, and so I'm making all these snap judgments, but I don't really know anything because I just bailed out or shut the conversation down instead of actually trying to listen and understand. But that is such a hard decision to make. I call it a stick with it moment. We talk about this a lot on our podcast, Top of Mind, to stay uncomfortable, to stick with that discomfort, stay open and curious. It takes practice. It takes intentional choice. And so that's part of what I'm doing. When I am reading the whole article top to bottom, I'm noticing when would I normally bail out? What would I have missed if I had stopped reading after the first 3 paragraphs? Oh, it turns out this character, I actually feel this lawmaker that they were quoting earlier, but then sort of towards the end of the article, they mentioned that this lawmaker also does this other thing that I actually like, but I would have only just had this view of this lawmaker as being this terrible person because they have this view on X. There's always the complicated nature of the story is often there. It's just not in the first 3 paragraphs. And so I also want to give journalists the benefit of the doubt that they are working to include a more complicated story. It's my job to read it before I complain about the work that they're doing. So read the whole article. If you just have 10 minutes, read the whole article, pick one article and read it top to bottom rather than scroll for 10 minutes on headlines. And maybe it goes without saying, but please try to not consume your news from social media. Most people say that their main source of news is social media. Social media can be great for a lot of things, like community connection. It is not a good place to consume your news. The algorithms are not giving you balanced perspective. They only want to keep you further scrolling. The algorithms want you to have emotional reactions. They're worse than just feeding headlines. So I have actually turned off a lot of my news. Like I don't follow any news organizations on social media. When people are sharing news articles, I just sort of like ignore it because that is not a productive way for me to consume news in a way that leaves me feeling optimistic and empowered to go do something.
Yeah, I feel the same way. When I said I was turning off all of my news, it mostly meant turning off all of my social media news. So I didn't make that distinction between apps and news outlets.
Yeah, it's tricky.
One of the things that you said that I really liked and I didn't know existed was, I forget exactly the phrasing used, but like solution-based journalism.
It's the Solutions Journalism Network. Yeah, check them out. They actually, it's a whole nonprofit that exists, and they also have so it's kind of twofold. One is that they have on their website, I think it's just solutionsjournalism.org, they have, they aggregate stories that qualify as solutions journalism. And people are reporting, this is not just like good news, puppies and rainbows, right? Like these are people reporting on war and climate change and conflicts and, all the tough stuff, racism, right? And democracy. But they're making sure to come at it from a solutions lens. Like not stopping at, I'm reporting on this because it's a terrible conflict or a terrible problem, but I'm reporting on this and here's some way to look at it. Here's someone who's trying something. Here's something that's been done. Here's something. Yeah. So solutionsjournalism.org, I think, is what it is. But also they do fellowships and training organizations. It's a bunch of journalists who came together and created this thing. And they go into local newsrooms and they train local newsrooms on how to embed or kind of imbue their work with more of a solutions lens. It's possible. It's part of what we do with Top of Mind. Every single time each week we take one tough topic that I know people are either inclined to avoid because of the way it makes them feel. You know, we're working on stuff about race. We do immigration, like the big issues, right? Organized labor. And we look for perspectives that are not going to fit easily into boxes. I want surprising perspectives that are going to kind of force us as we're listening to be like, oh, well, that's not what I would have expected to hear from that person based on how I judged them because of their, their job or their politics or their identity or their skin color, whatever, as a way. And we tell really compelling stories, but we're looking for surprising perspectives that are going to help us kind of just nudge us off of our certainty a little bit on the issue to try to help us practice being okay, hearing perspectives that don't necessarily align with our worldview, so that we come away. And if there are solutions, we lean into it. Sometimes there aren't solutions, but for me, feeling empowered isn't always about like, here's how we're going to fix climate change. It is, wow, having read that, I now have a much better understanding of why it is that coal-fired power is so difficult to get away from, and that it's in this way a very particular American challenge, and that here's the complicated regulatory history behind that. And so, yes, it's a bummer that I can't just walk away being like, here's the answer. But also, I'm empowered sometimes the empowerment is just that there's a lot more I need to go learn. I'm going to go look up some more information. I'm going to do some more reading. Or I'm actually kind of curious to know what my uncle, who's a coal miner, thinks about this now that I have a better sense, because I just kind of assumed he was an old fogey who isn't open to the realities of the world right now. I want to go have a conversation. Or I wonder what my neighbor thinks about this. And I wonder what's happening in my local community around this particular. I wonder where we get most of our power in my community, right? Like for me, empowerment is knowing where else I can turn to engage in the issue and work towards solutions.
Yeah, it sounds like you're leaning on giving people curiosity at the end of this thing. And I was actually going to ask you, so you're like going against the norm by not giving like a overly negative headline. And, you talked about the money early on and financing being a problem. And I was wondering to myself, like, how can you be successful if you're giving you're not going for the clickbait? And it sounds like by giving these complicated answers where you get people curious, that there's I don't exactly know how I want to phrase it, but it's like that's the sticky point, right?
People do, yes. So it's kind of tricky because I mean, the question is sort of like, well, who's going to listen to that if you're not, like, who's going to click? Who's going to listen? Who's going to, who's going to make this choice? Most people don't even know that they have to make that choice. We're kind of all just, I keep using the word yanked around, right? But like, we're kind of all just being led along by these algorithms and by this whole ecosystem that we've helped to create with our, consumption choices. And because of that, every single listener to our podcast is hard won, because because I recognize that it is, they have to have come to a place where they feel like it's not working, what their experience. They have to be. Now, here's the thing. Like I mentioned, 40% of Americans are news avoiders in some way. And so those are the people that we're trying to target, half of the country. There's plenty of people. But it takes a little bit of understanding how, what we try to do, what I realize is that the minute the hardest thing is to get people to not stop listening, right? Like to get them to listen through when they're confronted by the perspective that they don't like, because it is so easy to just scroll on to the next thing or to change the channel. And it is so easy to stay in a bubble where all I ever hear are viewpoints that perfectly match my worldview and make me feel righteously indignant. So what we try to do, because my goal is that everyone, no matter where they come from on that issue, no matter their perspective on the issue, I want everyone to hear something that will be a little bit challenging to them. And I want them to make the choice to stay uncomfortable, to stick with that discomfort. Here's that stick with it idea again. And that is a skill that can serve us in our daily life, but it is a choice and it is a muscle and it is a skill. So, Anthony, to your question, we try really, really hard, and we don't succeed every single week, but we try really, really hard to tell really engaging stories. We use really interesting storytelling, and and careful narration. And I work really hard as the host to sort of acknowledge the discomfort that we're kind of bringing to the table, and some of it is just like leading the listener along kind of by my side. When I'm feeling uncomfortable, I disclose it because I want you to know that I know this is hard. But it's also the payoff that you're talking about. Like for me, there is this crazy addictive dopamine type quality to a moment where all of a sudden I have a perspective shift. Like I never thought of it that way before moment. Or where I'm able to stay curious enough to where I suddenly see, for like a light bulb goes on, and I see for the first time how it's possible that a person could hold X view. Because suddenly I've heard their backstory and I'm like, gosh, if I had grown up in that same environment, I would probably have a similar view on guns or on, race or whatever, right? I'm not changing my mind, but now I have a much better sense of I had a blind spot here because I didn't grow up that way, so I didn't see that. Now I can see it. For me, that sense of clarity is exhilarating. It can also be scary because I'm like, well, what else am I missing? But if you can stay in curious mode, Monica Guzman, she's a senior fellow at Braver Angels, which is a group that works to overcome polarization in America, political polarization in particular. She wrote this great book called I Never Thought of It That Way. And she talks about how curiosity is that certainty is the enemy of conversation, and that curiosity is really the tool. I consider it sort of a superpower, the ability to turn on your curiosity. And it's really, for me, it's addictive because once you start asking more questions and peeling back more layers, I want people to walk away from our podcast having been like, gosh, there's a lot of stuff I never really thought about before. And that was kind of interesting. Now I want to know X or Y. So like when people will get in touch with me, they'll be like, well, you did this podcast on this particular topic, but you didn't talk about this and you didn't talk about this. But what about this? I really think you should have done this. And I don't feel offended at all. I love that because my response back to them is like, yes, thank you for listening. And that is exactly what I was hoping, is that you probably came into this episode thinking you knew everything there was to know and that you had a position and your position is the right position. And I don't care if you change your mind or not, but at the end, I really love it when you are like, but there's more I need to know about this issue. You've come a long ways. If I've turned on your curiosity, that is how we bridge divides. That is the only way we can actually have productive conversations with people that we really disagree with, or be comfortable in environments where we are out of our comfort zone and really want to bail out. The only way to get through that, I have found, to get through it productively, is to just be in full curiosity mode. Why am I feeling what I'm feeling here? What am I missing? I wonder what that person over there is feeling. And in those conversations, to start really peeling back the layers of, the question isn't, how could you have that view on guns or abortion? I don't understand how you could think this or that. Those questions are not productive. The question is, what in your life experience has shaped your position on this issue? That's where you can start to understand how it's way more productive to understand how the person came to hold the view that they're holding. And then for me to share my personal stories of how what's influenced my view on this issue. Neither of us is going to change our opinion probably, but by understanding the human experience that has shaped your perspective, I am going to see you as a person who's complicated and has a lot of identities. And we may not actually solve the problem or come to some middle ground, because agreeing wasn't the point to begin with. The point to these encounters, the point to reading, and I mentioned I would tell you one of my favorite hacks. One of my favorite hacks in my news consumption is when I choose the article, a lot of times I'll try to intentionally choose an opinion article that I really disagree with. And that's the story that I'm going to read word from top to bottom, because that's like a daily practice of being able to stay curious instead of shutting down or bailing out when and to keep my curiosity flowing is the way that I can get to at least better understanding of the other view. And the beauty of it is, like, what's the point? If nobody's changing their mind, then what's the point of even having that conversation, right? It makes it much harder for us to see the world in these binary, good and bad. But it also, I have found, and there's some incredible stories I can tell you of that people have also found this to happen in their lives, that by engaging deeply, listening carefully, and coming to understand how the person I'm talking to came to hold that particular viewpoint, it helps me to be a better advocate for the things that I care about. We can't really advocate for what we care about if all we know is the top line talking point. It's like trying to have a deep conversation about something when you've only ever read headlines about it. And then the minute you peel back the layers, you're like, oh, well, I hadn't thought of that. Well, I hadn't thought of that. Well, okay, and then we just get more defensive, and then it's like it just is not going anywhere. So there are lots and lots of stories of people who are advocates for important issues like abortion. There's an incredible story out of Boston about abortion activists on both sides of the issue who in the 90s held a series of conversations, secret talks for 6 years. And at the end of it, none of them changed their position. They all were even more firm in their views for and against abortion. But they cared for one another as people. They became friends. And most importantly, they lowered the rhetoric. They were no longer able to speak in dehumanizing ways about the other side. So it changed the way that they advocated, and they became better advocates because they better understood on a very deep and personal level the opposing viewpoint.
Yeah, as you were telling that story, the only thought that came to mind was like perspective will lead to empathy.
I love it. I talk about blind spots a lot. I'm one of these people when I'm in my car where I'm kind of paranoid that I'm missing something when I'm I feel like I have to look over my shoulder 10 times. I have an old school car. I don't have lots of video cameras and stuff on it. So I'm checking the mirrors. What am I missing in my blind spot? I have the tiniest little car, right? So it's not even like I have a very big blind spot, but we all have them no matter what. And we work really hard in our vehicles to overcome that with our mirrors and with looking over our shoulder and with all these rear view cameras and stuff now. But it's shocking how easy it is to forget that we have blind spots in our lives, that because, that there's only so much that I can actually see and understand without having other people expose me to their viewpoints, because I only know what it's like to be a straight white woman who grew up in my community in my time period, right? With my income level. There's just lots of things that are outside of my comprehension, perspectives that are not going to resonate for me because I just haven't lived it. So we have to actively work to overcome our blind spots. And I think you're right, Anthony. Perspective is everything.
What advice can you give to people to kind of get over the initial, the hump of the thing that you're saying is opposite of what I believe, therefore you are wrong, and everything you say I'm just going to ignore because you're wrong?
Yeah.
And how do you stop them from just shutting down so that they can find that curiosity and they can actually, ask those tough questions and learn other viewpoints?
Yeah. So I actually have a special series on our podcast where we talk with people about how they've done this in daily life. So like a specific, we call it a stick with it moment where you're staying open and curious. You're choosing to stick with the discomfort instead of shut down or lash out. So one thing that I will say is that emotions are involved, and that's what makes it so difficult, because the moment you find yourself, the way you get to a stick with it moment is that you have a bad reaction to something. Like it is in that moment where you look around and you're like, oh my gosh, I am so out of my comfort zone. I don't want to be here. I got to bail out. That exists for a reason. It exists to keep us safe from the lions and the tigers, right? But in most of our lives, we are not, at risk when that is happening. Sometimes it is. Like we have that response to keep us safe. But most of the time when it's going off, it's because we are encountering a perspective, or we're suddenly find ourselves in an environment where we don't necessarily feel like everyone else is like us, or that they don't agree. We're not at risk, but our response thinks that we're at risk. So the first thing is to recognize that you're having a natural reaction and that it is wired in us, and that you can choose to calm it down. The only way that I have found to really, when those like emotions really start to go, because for me it's the fear, it's the anger, it's the insecurity, it's kind of all that stuff that makes me either want to flee or fight. I use pretty basic mindfulness techniques. So it's, I have to kind of like be the observer for a moment. There's a little bit of mindful breathing, even if it's just like taking a couple of deep breaths, recognizing, oh, I'm having a reaction. Kind of like looking at it, naming it, right? In order to there's no mystery to it, but it's so hard to do. I took like an 8-week mindfulness course because I just could not figure out how to stop my emotions from hijacking everything that was going on in my life. So look, it's really hard. So I use a little bit of mindful techniques, a little bit of breathing, a little bit of this visualization that allows me to kind of be on the balcony, is what one mediator calls it. Like go on the balcony and kind of look at yourself so that you have a little bit of less, so you can kind of recognize, oh, you're not at risk, and sort of this is what's going on. And then the key thing is to start with a question. So because once you can sort of say, all right, I'm going to stay, that's the first step. The second thing is that your gut instinct is going to be to try to justify yourself or make your argument, make your perspective known, try to make yourself comfortable. That's going to be your next instinct. Okay, well, if I'm going to stay here, then I at least don't want to be deeply uncomfortable. So, and that's the next thing you have to intercept. Because the only way this is going to work is if you are okay staying uncomfortable. When you want to try to make yourself feel uncomfortable, that's when we start trying to say, well, this is what I think about it, trying to make your argument, or you're trying to convince them, right? Or you're trying to point out all the ways in which they're wrong if this is a conversation that you're having. All of those things I see as an attempt on your part to make yourself comfortable in this environment. What you can do instead is make the goal not comfort, but understanding. Okay, this is going to be uncomfortable, and I'm going to maybe just commit to myself that so this is what I do when I read an article, right? It's a news article by somebody that I really, really, really disagree with, and I find their perspective even like deeply distasteful, and I know it from the beginning. Normally, I just wouldn't even read it because it makes me feel all these awful feelings that I don't like, and I feel, like indignant and outraged. This is what I'm practicing when I read that article top to bottom, is I'm practicing breathing. I'm practicing sort of continuing to be like, I wonder why. What kinds of questions could I ask that would help, that would lead to more understanding here. And I'm practicing feeling uncomfortable. Oh, look, I survived. It took me 10 minutes to read that article. I'm still alive. And now I actually have a little bit more, knowledge of this. Yeah, I kind of sweated through my armpits, and that was kind of a bummer. But, maybe next time I won't be quite so sweaty when I'm going through that emotional experience, right? So I think some of it is just practice. I have found that can be really helpful for me, so that when I'm face-to-face with somebody that I really disagree with, I can make the choice, okay, I know I can deal with this. I can handle discomfort for a little while. And then the next step is, okay, well, I'm going to just focus on being curious. I'm going to focus on asking questions. And I'm going to focus especially not on the issue. I'm not going to try to debate whether or not they should have that perspective and all the reasons why they should or shouldn't have that perspective because of X, Y, and Z. What I'm going to do is, again, what I mentioned earlier, is I'm going to ask questions about how the person came to understand or came to feel this way. So if they're telling me, I think that, I think this about abortion and it's because of this and because, this is what this is the right way to see it. Instead of me trying to say, well, but what about in this instance for abortion? And what about in this instance? Or, but what about this case over here? Or, but what if this happens, right? We're not going to do that. I'm going to ask questions about the person and not the issue. And not like sort of judgy questions like, how could you possibly, as a person who cares about X, Y, and Z, hold this view? But is there something in your life? Would you mind sharing? I really want to understand. This is helpful too, to say, I think you probably know that we really disagree on this, but I actually would really like to better understand. Would you mind if I asked a few questions? Would you, are you willing to talk about this a little more deeply? I'd like to understand. So it's helpful to get the person's sort of like agreement to have the conversation first. Otherwise, they're going to be like, well, what the heck is this happening? Is this a trap? And are you going to try to like spring something on me? And I don't know what's going on. So if it's a conversation we're talking about, I recommend you get their permission in a very humble way and that you make your desires known. I would really like to understand better. This is a perspective that I struggle to understand. Would you mind telling me? And if you're willing, I'd love to hear just a little bit more. You're not committing. Look, you don't want to have to do an hour of this, right? You've kind of in your head said, I can handle this discomfort for maybe 10 minutes and then I'm out. Okay, so you're just like, it's time limited. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to stay engaged in this conversation and I'm going to ask open-ended questions that will help me better understand this person and their view. And then what you'll find oftentimes, if you're asking, can you share an experience? What did that feel like for you? How has that experience then shaped the way you think about this other aspect of this issue? Get them to talk about their life experience. They are going to feel understood and seen, and they will probably want to turn the tables and find out a little bit about your experience too. And so make your responses focused on your experience that has led you to your views. Well, I grew up in a community where this, or my mother had a miscarriage and this, or, whatever it is, or my religious background, has always taught me this. And so, or this is what my experience was when we were trying to get pregnant in my marriage or whatever, right? So that it's that kind of thing is, you're helping them to see you as a person and you're seeing them as a person. And then you can just very, graciously bow out. You don't have to solve the issue right there. Don't try to have this be like the be-all, end-all conversation on this topic that you're going to have with this person. You can, once you feel like you've sweated enough, you can be like, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. This has really, brought some things to my mind. I have some things I want to think about. I'm still struggling to understand this, but I really appreciate you sharing your perspective. That's it.
It's super good advice. As we kind of wrap things up here now, I wanted to ask you, what's next for you? What are your goals, short, long term, and how can we and our listeners help you achieve those goals?
Oh, wow. That's so generous. Well, I'd love to have you listen to Top of Mind, the podcast. So you can find us on all the podcast apps. Look for Top of Mind with Julie Rose. I'd really love to hear if what I've described is the experience you're having listening to the podcast, in ways that we could do more of that to help you. We're also getting ready to launch here in July a whole special podcast. I can't quite say the new name yet, but we'll be talking about it on our website, where we're going to spin off these stick with it moments into a weekly deep dive into one real experience that someone has had. And we're going to dissect it, how they did it, how they, set aside their threat response, what that felt like, what they learned in the middle of it, why they're glad they did, so that we can get a lot of really practical examples of how to exercise this in our daily lives. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be talking about it on our podcast feed, Top of Mind with Julie Rose. And, my goal personally is just to do this more in my daily life. I find I don't encounter people I disagree with as much as I think I should be. We live in very sort of, we have sorted ourselves very well in terms of where we live and where we go to church and where we work. And so I'm trying to put myself in positions and trying to open my mouth in more places so that I can have more conversations with people who see the world differently from me.
That's awesome.
Got it.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
It's brave too.
It is.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, so I will, for one, will definitely be giving the podcast a listen because it sounds like the type of content that I actually need to listen to more instead of just doom scrolling and watching, the 6 o'clock news. We want to thank you so much for taking the time with us today, Julie. It was a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed hearing all about you and your perspective on things. And thank you so much for taking the time with us.
It's really been my pleasure, Jason and Anthony. It was great to meet you. Thanks so much.
Yep. You too. Take care.